All right. So now, hypothetically, we are live. There we go. Looks like there's just a slight lag there.
Okay.
This is, I think this is episode 9. Um,
That feels right.
it functions as if true.
Uh-huh. I can
Um,
double check really quickly.
well, I'm doing it right now. You can't see it
Okay.
because I haven't shared my screen and it's private. Let's see. Yeah, we're on episode 9. It's just us. So we were going to talk about the newly posted methodology. It's more sort of an outline or notes. I mean, it's coherent, but it's not fleshed out to the degree it probably will be or certainly will be in a finished version. Let me just go ahead and share the screen here. Excuse me. You should be able to see that, right?
I can.
Okay. Um, so let's see here. Some of the texts. So the gist of this, it just sort of outlines some of the research questions as a way of sort of foregrounding, what we're doing and why in terms of the methods. It articulates a couple of the research questions here. Some of them obviously are a little more general, right? How do hits depict human labor? That's a fairly general question because there are lots of potential ways to answer that, right?
Right.
Some of which we might be doing later. And then we sort of it goes down to a sort of a more specific how can hits be classified in distinct coherent categories based on the language they use, right? I mean, if you're answering that, then it's probably you're going to be looking at the particular language which lends itself to the kind of content analysis stuff we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then a sub point to that might be, once you have a better notion of what's going on in the language, how might that correlate with other hit metadata, right? Such as compensation, required qualifications, Turkers' feelings. I didn't know a better term than feelings. Because what
Yeah.
we're looking at there is, Turkers provide responses, not on the site itself, but through third parties. Turkers can contribute to a user-generated, like rate how fair a requester is. Platform or platforms that do they respond, or if they respond appropriately, do they reject a high volume of responses? So there's a lot of this interesting metadata that doesn't exist, at least not in a public way, on mTurk itself, but has cropped up in sort of an ancillary or a para way around that platform. And so and we have access to that, and so that can be really useful to see, if you can categorize, let's say, jobs, hits, into groups based on the language they use, right? And we sort of speculated about this previously. Things like some jobs, maybe use human sensory data in
Mm-hmm.
ways, asks you to identify something in an image, or maybe even transcription, things that are perhaps invoking human sensory data, and how that might be a little bit different than a job that's asking a human to, say, fill out a questionnaire or survey or something like that, right? Which isn't, quite literally, I need your eyes or ears,
Right.
understood broadly, to, um, how do you feel? Does this advertisement make you want to buy this cologne or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So if we can maybe see that in the language, but then how does that correlate with things like compensation? Are you compensated when you have to provide a summary of a text differently than identify if a dog is in this picture, right?
Right.
And how do you feel about those jobs? Because maybe, and there's different granularity to feel. It's like, maybe this is fair compensation, but it takes longer and is more sort of cognitively exhausting. So it's not worth it in
Yeah.
terms of, I'm getting a nickel versus a penny but having to write a summary is very different than, yeah, there's a dog here.
Hmm. Yeah, I hadn't even thought too about, and I wonder if it may not add a complication or just another wrinkle, is that we were largely focused on like what language would get used, but it may be too that it's also what capacities are being asked for.
Yeah.
Like imaginative or cognitive, or if it's just, and that might not be distinct or just sensory, right? Like I need your eyes,
right,
as an extension of some sensing apparatus.
Yeah, and that might be interesting when we move from this into potentially. Let me just flip back over here. If we're potentially using some of this stuff in later products where we're looking more specifically at the cultural technique, and we looked at possible triangulation. There are some of those services. The one that springs immediately to mind is the one that's literally called Be My Eyes.
Yeah.
Which specifically is for people with visual impairments. And, it's a very kind of ad hoc thing where a person with visual impairment is at a grocery store and can use Be My Eyes and basically just sort of point their phone camera at, a rack at the grocery store. And, with the hope, can you point out the Chex cereal for me here? Or, that might be interesting when we get to that point to kind of triangulate the notion of using sensory data, in that way versus how it's being used potentially on Turk, It might be interesting to see some differences there. Anywho.
Yeah.
Right. So, anywho, where did I put the methodology? Here it is. So, anywho, those are, research questions. Obviously, it's not like we can answer these larger ones completely, but that is something that is overarching in this particular attempt.
Yeah, and they're kind of nicely, as with I think various aspects of the project, nicely sort of nested. Right, that depicting human labor, characterizing human agency, right? We're sort of casting this wide net of, can we ask different kinds of questions that will, tease out what the boundaries of the human are in terms of mechanical Turks.
Yeah.
So, I think part of the, particularly as we think about, this first stage of the project, doing this content analysis and the ways in which that might fold into the other stage we imagine where we maybe start putting our own hits up to see their success rate, that in many ways we're right now sort of still thinking about what language will be best for even asking the questions and posing the hits. So
yeah, right, yeah. And it's not as though, it can feel like it, but it's not necessarily as though the language itself then becomes the baseline, right, or the atom, because you'd quail at saying, okay, but what's the core thing, and then we can build out. And yet there is some utility probably in relating these things together, and it's possible that the way to facilitate that is by first looking at the language itself. All of that is to say, I don't think we want to set or sort of reinstate a hierarchy of meaning where, if you can peel away the layers of artifice, it's the same sort of problem you have. It's like, well, sociology is just psychology, is just communication, is just linguistics. You know what I mean? Where you set up this chain of trying to peel away the layers of increasingly social artifice to get to the core atom of things, and it's unclear if that's a real hierarchy or if that's a presumptive hierarchy or or an imposed one.
No, I think what's interesting about the sort of content analysis is we're really, I just lost my train of thought, right? To a certain extent, right? We're not we don't want to peel anything back, right? In many ways, we're interested in the language that gets used, and we don't see that language as, oh, I've lost. Well, I've not lost my train of thought. It's just a really bad train of thought, I think. Um, like we're not interested in the language as representational, right? We're looking in what the language does, like not what's meant by this term, but what work does this term do within mechanical Turks, right? So whether or not, so for instance, in our methodology, right, we have human labor and then human agency, right? We could tease out what those mean, but what in that network, what does labor do that's potentially different than what the word agency does, right? And are those being treated as synonymous within mechanical Turks, or are they actually creating some difference that might matter, right? To describe something as agency, human agency, versus describing something as human labor.
Yeah.
We're not interested in potentially that they're pointing at the same thing, that we're interested in what effect gets produced in that system by the intentional or unintentional choice to describe it as labor or agency. And then that might then allow us to discern, I don't know.
You can see this, right? You can see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, potentially, is there a way to talk about that as language as operational versus representational? Is that a fair?
Yeah,
so
and
rather than representing a meaning, it's a question of what is it doing? What operation is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is going back to our conversation with Casey Boyle and the research methods, the field methods thing I did this summer, is the interest in sort of non-representational methods. That methods that are more oriented towards not just registering effects, but that the research method itself is producing various effects, as opposed to simply seeing itself as representing some content or some thing that's there.
Yeah.
So that it could be when we're doing a discourse analysis, but is that discourse analysis going to be akin? The sense I get is that sometimes discourse analysis is you do the discourse analysis to get at something behind the discourse. Mm-hmm. And I think we're actually just we're going to stop at that.
Right.
There's a sense in which we actually don't want to dig deep. We're just using the discourse analysis to determine the shape and impact of, right? That we're basically interested in what kind of, not just what definition of the human is baked into mechanical Turks. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. And in that sense, we'd be using language to reveal or expose that. But I think from the cultural technique standpoint is that how does the operation of mechanical Turks create a particular kind of human subject?
Yeah.
Not that we want to reveal what mechanical Turk thinks a human is, but what kinds of humans does a mechanical Turk generate?
Well, and so this might be something to point out here, since we haven't covered this yet. So on Manifold, and right now we're still on the same version. In texts here, texts are an interesting kind of thing because, so right now this text, behind it is a Google Doc, but you ingest texts into Manifold. And when you do that, it does give you these kind of capacities where you can highlight and annotate. I want to point this out because visitors should have this capacity as well. Let me check, in fact. You do have to log in, so you do have to create an account, which I think is something we've discussed because it's not on the open internet to the degree that potentially vandalism could occur, automated vandalism, oddly enough. I think you do have to create an account, but after that,
I'm just imagining someone creating a human intelligence task that involves
right.
putting graffiti up on our mechanical Turks project.
You should have the capacity to do things like annotate, and it gives you the passage. Nah, it's not private. So, I mean, here we could potentially put notes like, do we need to explicate in the methodology? Think about, we're not necessarily revealing what's really there, but
Right.
Tracing how Turk is doing a particular thing, or facilitating the creation of particular subjects.
Yeah, I mean, thinking through the kind of the methods is that, like, we're not. I don't think we imagine what we're doing as some kind of expose on Turks.
Right.
Like, we're trying to think with it. I mean, like, we're following it in that sense, that we're not opening it or interrogating it, right? Whatever. I mean, we're not doing those things, but our primary jest is like, where, if we follow a mechanical Turk, where's that leading?
Yeah.
What's that leading to, as opposed to what's it leading from? Now I'm just playing with prepositions.
Well, so I mean, that might be something to address. The next part of the methodology points out, it says the questions here are open-ended and the methods are correspondingly exploratory rather than determinative. So this may address some of this.
Mm-hmm.
We seek different descriptive insights. We need not identify the correct method to answer a precise question. We want variance. We want to work with the machines to incorporate different perspectives. We're pinging in the darkness, attempting to map the contours of an unknown landscape. Methods are more buckshot than laser. This is kind of setting up, the reason why we don't or won't necessarily make judgments about, okay, what we're going to be doing with the language is precisely this operation, right? Maybe building this particular topic model, for example, with these particular parameters, and then defend, here's why those are the correct choices. Which in a lot of instances, when you're doing that kind of content analysis, you would. You probably want to point out, I've done some statistical checking, and when you shift the parameters this way or that way, and there are ways you can do that statistically and see, what kind of indeterminacy is introduced when you make these changes, and that's why you're making these choices. It's, of course, kind of thoroughly rhetorical, where the choices you make there do, have a significant impact on what you see.
Mm-hmm.
So then you, of course, have to make choices and then defend them. What I'm sort of foregrounding here is we're going to be doing a lot of different things intentionally, because we're not precisely trying to answer the specific question, but what is MTurk actually doing?
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, partially what we're doing here is firing off a bunch of different operations you can do with textual data.
Mm-hmm.
And, probably we'll see some different things in there. Maybe there will be some consistencies across different operations. Maybe there'll be some big variances that might be useful. Maybe even worthy of interrogating, why does it show this if you plug in that variable, or you use a topic model versus what you see when you apply, sentiment analysis or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so it's kind of foregrounding that. And then this gets into how we're actually doing that. So collecting a corpus here, and then how I'm doing it, sort of points out that at any given time, you'll see, maybe 1,000, although that mean is... So, for example, a lot of times it is around 1,000. It'll be between like 1,200 to 700. But last night when I did the data run, there were 8,000. However, a significant portion of that were the same requester, essentially wanting the same job, but they'd posted many separate posts essentially looking for the same job. I mean, within that post, there were still, I think there were 400, I could actually probably look, 400 or so hits within that same post. They just clearly wanted a
Would they
whole
just
whack.
So is it like a wide net, or is it just different, slightly different approaches to the same thing?
Now, let's take a look here. So this is the public data sheet. And so it starts because, as I discussed in the methodology, when we're looking at the A sample, it's before you do the sample, you rank them by available hits. So each job can have multiple hits, and the reasoning behind that, doing that instead of doing them by when they're posted, is if you want a sense of what the bulk of the available hits on Mechanical Turk at any given time are, it makes sense to rank them by available hits rather than posting date, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what we're saying is this is a large portion of what's actually on there right now rather than what just got posted in the moment I checked. So anywho, boy, I got too many things open. It's bogging down.
It's a lot of tabs, my friend.
Yeah, I know. So I think, let's see, where does it start? Because you'll notice the data starts to get really homogenized. Here it is. So for the next,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
200 of these, it's this. And the descriptions aren't even descriptive. It's this sort of, it says ad hoc match ACC JP, which is likely a code for Japan. So it's not even really telling you what it wants there. If you compare that with, let me scroll up here, something that actually provides a title here and then a description, right? This is a title, write the words shown in an image. Do not have to write too many words. Well, that's actually also the description. So here's a title description example. Extract data from shopping receipt. And then the description is, if the shopping receipt image is readable, extract items in quantities that are not blackened out, right? That's a good sort of representative demonstration of a title and then a brief description. You can see when we get to these, it doesn't really even provide that. So interestingly, this is going to be fairly wasted data in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because trying to pull anything textually, semantic or anything out of this is going to be futile. Because all you're getting is this, ad hoc match ACC. So I actually this is the first time this has happened.
Yeah.
I actually was wrestling with what to do with this last night.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about it is it confronts us, again, what are we doing when we're doing a content analysis, right?
Yeah.
If we're interested in the language in terms of what the language points to,
yeah,
then this is useless. But if what we're interested in is what the language does, then this becomes interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, right, right, the fact that there doesn't appear to be any semantic content is weirdly enough not necessarily trouble for us, because we're kind of not solely or only or at all interested in semantic content in one way.
Well,
so that the fact that this gets described this way is useful to us. I'm not sure how, but my instinct is that given what we just said about whether we're interested in a non-representational or representational content analysis, that this is just as useful potentially.
Well, you see, and ultimately I was like, well, I'm going to keep it for a few reasons. One is, you want to be careful about when you're doing collection about cutting things out at that level,
Yeah.
Because you can always cut it later if the need is there, but if you cut it in the collection, it's like it's the memory hole.
Yeah.
It's like it never existed. So I was like, I'm going to keep this. But I think you're exactly right that in some ways this can be useful, because looking at it now, it almost raises the question, because, human Turkers would arguably look at this, and this is the information they have to go by too.
Yeah.
It's like, what is what is this? It almost raises the question: Is this courting non-human Turkers?
Right,
I mean,
right. What is?
is this written for bots?
Yeah,
Because the language suggests, or the text I should say suggests, it's almost like this is feeding into a bot's input.
yeah,
So one thing is we want to make sure the method then, and since we're using essentially a range of methods, it's useful if something like this surfaces,
yeah,
because it's like, well, maybe some of these are being written for non-humans.
yeah. Or Turkers who are so enculturated into this system that this might actually make sense to them.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that came up. Let's see. Did I post this here? Where did I put that? Oh,
Yeah,
shoot.
but while you're
Sorry, go ahead.
scrolling through that, I mean, what would be interesting for us is if we're interested in what it means, then for a certain standpoint it's meaningless. But if we're interested in what it does, then that little segment of of data that you've collected becomes like, what is that doing here? Is a really
Yeah.
potentially compelling. Is it for bots or is it for people who've can now think like bots, which of course brings us back to the whole tension of the mechanical Turk, right? The artificial intelligence.
Yeah, there was a link I'm fumbling to pull up here. Let's see. Here it is. Ba, 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 ba. And I guess I haven't gotten around to posting this yet. But this was just this sort of bloggish post. But I thought it was useful because it's about Descartes' robot daughter. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, there's one of the guys that's in the folder, Dominic Petman, wrote a fictional short story about the robot daughter.
Yeah, and so I mean, as is often the case, whatever we want to call facts about this thing seem pretty muddy.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of notion of this replicant of a deceased daughter, and then there's this sort of sensationalized account that he was on a ship and the crew found out about it and then threw it overboard because they thought it
Mm-hmm.
was cursed or magical in some way. So this kind of concludes with this notion of it calls that problem. Let's see, where is it here? Da, da, da. Yeah, the Francine problem. Let's define the Francine problem as what happens when robots' human-like traits lead humans to become overly credulous about the humanity of robots. So this in part is about, the issue of what happens when humans start to ascribe human-like traits to robots. What it calls the Francine problem, framing it as a problem is a choice there.
Mm-hmm.
When people start ascribing human-like traits to become, causes humans to become overly credulous about humanity's robots. But what's interesting here is the flip side. It says, what if human-like traits in robots lead humans to become overly incredulous about the humanity of fellow humans? Right? That's a two-way street. Not only the attribution of human-like traits to non-humans, but then the flip side of that is when you start being more skeptical about the humanity of other humans.
Yeah, this was. How was it? This was, I think, Kenneth Burke's response to be like the behaviorism is like the worry about. Right, you have to be worried about that. Historically, we've always been worried about anthropomorphizing animals, and Burke makes this joke that now with behaviorism, we have to worry about anthropomorphizing humans.
Yeah.
That like behaviorism, right? If you understand things in a mechanical way, it in this sense makes you incredulous about supposedly the human features of humans.
Right. Yeah.
Because even they that whatever we imagine as a human characteristic, we keep discovering over and over again that
Right.
humans may not in fact have any of those either.
Yeah. So that's an interesting sort of aspect of this. So yeah. So kind of moving from there, this talks about how collection is happening, and as I mentioned, this is the first time that there was just sort of this. And as I mentioned, I mean, on average, you'll find about 1,000 at any given time. This last night when I did collection, there was 8 times that, and a large portion of it was this. So we'll see. I mean, the next collection would be tomorrow. We'll see if this is sort of a large bolus that gets moved through, or if it's still there, or we'll see what happens.
Well, and this occurrence is also, I mean, I think points towards the ways in which the method gets articulated, right? Precisely why we're collecting in the ways in which we're collecting, so that we know whether this is a dump or an ongoing thing.
Yeah, I framed that as to avoid overrepresenting any particular sample and mitigate any potential outlier chains. Potentially what I should say there, though, because that's a defensive statement, we're doing it to wash out any unusual things. Probably also should say that it includes.
Yeah, we're trying to catch them.
Yeah, because this is defensive. It's washing out any weird outliers, but it's also, but it catches them.
Yeah.
That it includes outliers, not just that it mitigates them. Oops.
Yeah, I mean, that goes with the pinging, right? We want to know if what's popped up is a part of the mass we're trying to ascertain, or whether it's, something that's floated close to it.
Yeah. So that's that, and that's the A sample. I mean, as you know, there's basically 2 collection pools, and this talks about how A collects comparatively more events but fewer metadata elements because of the way it goes. And this kind of articulates what I already mentioned about why it ranks by items per page. So essentially, why it goes by available hits as its sort before doing the collection, because what you want there is the bulk of what is on Turk at this time of collection. And this also just points out that we're pretty confident we don't need IRB approval. I think I mentioned that here. If not, I probably should mention it.
There is, I think, right after in that paragraph you were just reading, you have a parenthetical in there, but what we heard from Amy Evans.
Yeah, although that's to.
Oh, that's just a nod. Okay.
It pulls the requester. That might be something to point out. I can't remember if that's included. No, doesn't look like it. Then it talks about the B sample, which is a little bit different, because that one this is where we're including those the Turker feedback, because the A sample, really this is all stuff you can just get from Mechanical Turk. You can see the information here. And I believe this is all available just on Turk. Approval time, approval rate, activity level, and then of course these other things like the rewards you get in the qualifications. All of these, I believe, are just on Turk. The B sample, this is where it's including that feedback stuff from Turkers. So TV, for example, stands for Turker view. TO also stands for another service. I can't remember if it's Turk or Observer. I should know this. I've kind of been overwhelmed with acronyms. And this is where we're getting that feedback stuff. In order to get that, it's just not as, it's more labor intensive. You can't just sort of collect the data in a big, or at least not any way that I'm familiar with, in a big whack, so it's a little bit more labor intensive. That one, this points out, we do the sort in this case by post date, because this is not going for the breadth. The A sample kind of is. It's trying to get a thick slice, of what's on there.
Mm-hmm.
The B sample, in part because of the collection mechanics themselves, you're just not shooting for that. So it goes by post date to get a notion of what's happening right now rather than what the bulk is. Essentially, the way it's kind of discussed here is the B sample is more interested in depth. The A sample is more interested in breadth.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the gist of it. I did post the scripts I'm using to clean, and you can see it looks sort of, unless you know what you're looking at, it's sort of gobbledygook. It's just these things that are in the information you get, and then how you replace them. This code means it replaces those with tabs, and /r replaces them with line breaks and that kind of thing. Yeah, that's the gist of it. And then here at the end, it talks about some of the potential operations we're going to apply. So as I alluded to, things like topic models, which have their, topic models in some ways, it's not like they're, it's that they've been kind of used quite a bit in a lot of different ways. So what topic models try and do is take a big. I'm getting some feedback. Did you take off here?
They're back on. Sorry.
Okay. What they do is, they essentially take groups of words and then try and emerge important ones out of them. And so there are ways those have been kind of, I don't want to say overused, but like any sort of new tool or newish tool, they were applied in a lot of situations, and now it's sort of at the point where there was potentially some backlash, and then it's sort of mellowed to, okay, well, what are these actually good at doing, right? Just like any tool where it gets used quite a bit to see where can insight emerge, and then we realize, oh, this this isn't going to be the key to everything. So then, what does it actually do? Just like with big data, right?
Yeah.
So anywho, there are some sample ways to do topic models, LDA and STM, structured topic models. Some clustering, which can help with pulling together things like similar documents. If we're treating hits as documents.
Mm-hmm.
Word embeddings, which are useful because they add levels of connection to context, and you can do that at the word level. You can do it at the document level. There are different ways to do that. And this is this kind of connects back with the beginning. If you had a specific question about what precisely are you wanting to see here, you'd probably find a method. You'd select something that would then show that, and then you defend why that's an appropriate choice and why the parameters you're using are effective. And you can actually, statistically look at variance and say, here's why I'm choosing this, because if I choose something else, it kind of it makes this sort of unusual variance or whatever. For us, we're not doing that. We're doing a lot of different things because we want to see different stuff.
Yeah.
And so partially what we want to point out here is why that's an intentional choice and not a sloppy one. Because on the face of it, it can seem sloppy. We're just going to throw a lot of stuff at it. And this is a common charge with the humanities in some ways, particularly when they're using methods that have come from outside of the humanities, right? That it's being used in a sloppy way.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I think that criticism resonates. A lot of times I think it sticks.
Yeah.
So here I think, we have to do a little work explicating why it's not sloppy just to throw a lot of stuff at the corpus and see what pops out. Because, specifically what we are trying to do is explore and see what different stuff says So since that's what we are trying to do, it does make sense to throw a lot of things at the at the
Yeah.
corpus and see what pops out.
I mean, even the move earlier to set up the methodology or the method around. If you noticed, we sort of used defensive language to set it up,
Yeah.
and switching from that, because I think if you're trying to demonstrate that you're not being sloppy, you automatically take up a kind of defensive position about your method. Right? We're doing this to avoid this bad thing from happening, whereas we're doing it not to avoid a bad thing happening, but not to create a bad thing, but potentially some unexpected or surprising thing.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna, whoops, just mushing the keyboard. Yeah. This is defensive rather than generative language.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be something to point out, yeah, sort of throughout that. Yeah, that we're doing this for productive ends rather than to make it bulletproof in some way, right? It's not like we're trying to find a bulletproof method here. We're trying to generate stuff out of the corpus. It does sort of point out things also, with the goal of ascertaining what emerges. We want to hear what these different methods say. Additionally, we'll be guided in our explanations by specialists who will vet our processes. Right now there's not much more to be said about that, but hopefully, I think there will be people who can contribute to shaping this as we go, right? I did these. In fact, I think I pointed out on the notes. Here are some of the operations we're doing. Does this make sense for our goal? And are there people who can help us explicate what we find? Let's see, where is that? Oh, it's right here. Falls under the heading of stats person. People who will be able to help us, right? I mean, because ideally we're going to be bringing in other people who can point out stuff about this material as well. So it's less a situation of defending, I guess, what we're doing than trying to include multiple things intentionally.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's totally in line with the ways in which we've imagined peer review for this project.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
As peer review as generative informative rather than gatekeeping in some way.
Yeah. The rigor comes from the fact that we just keep doing it, but that it shows up and resonates with particular people.
Yes, that's the gist of what this is, and I can revise this one thing, and it is one sort of quirk about manifold. It's not a flaw; it's just an aspect of it. It's not super easy to change this text, even as an administrator, just to change this text directly.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you these kind of useful tools for things like highlighting and annotating, associating resources, sharing. Those are all great, but it's not like I can go on the back end and just type away at this, at least not any way that I've found. What you have to do is fold these sort of comments, these changes in to the text itself somewhere else. Either copy and paste this into a text editor of some sort. What I've done is just left these in that same Google Doc folder that we're using. So I'd have to make the changes there, and then you can re-ingest it. I think in part that's because I think Manifold is largely a scholarly publishing platform.
Yeah.
And so I think it views texts, this unit, as
finished.
Semi-stable.
Yeah.
Like chapters that you would be getting comments on. And maybe even not that. Maybe even finished ones. So it's just sort of a quirk of Manifold. It's not like it's a big problem. It's just you can envision a scenario in which the administrator would be able to just directly change the imported text based on those highlights and annotations and that kind of thing. I'm not finding a way that Manifold can do that directly. We do need to update as we've
Yeah.
said, but anywho, that's the gist of that. Did you?
Yeah.
You said were there questions you had that we didn't address, or?
No, I feel good. I mean, relatively.
Right, as good as any academic can.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
It's
That's the
just
thing.
it's just the baseline dread, not any new ones.
No, no, no. Same as last time.
Let's see. All right, so that's that. Yeah, and even though I keep saying this one will probably be shorter, it's not much shorter.
No.
So I guess the things to sort of on the to-do list are some of the stuff we did before. You've got some feelers out for potential guests,
Uh-huh.
and we do have other folks in case those don't line up. It's not like we don't have other folks that we could contact. We do want to look into upgrading Manifold as well, which I guess probably would be just an email to Jeff, I'm assuming.
Yeah. He's out of the country currently.
Mm.
I think he's in Prague or something like that. So
Yeah.
it's all very Cold War.
Yeah. So I think those are on the immediate horizon. I'll do some revisions on the methodology stuff. I mean, of course, it's not like that's a final version, but I do want to fold in those comments while they're relatively fresh and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I wonder too if there's a way to sync it up with the larger collaborative nature of the project.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, ideally, and that's why I like having those things, because I was like, should we fold these into the resources, and just for example, because like you could make these resources a separate category, and then you could do something like include a Google Doc link as we do with the data.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is an option. What you're doing there is then, in a way, kind of punting it off onto that third party. It is something you could do. We then are then sort of return to questions of, would those Google Docs be on the open internet, or would you need to have a Google account? Which then does ask people to get an account if they don't already. Most people probably do have them, but it's not like it necessarily solves all those questions. It just kind of moves them to a different arena.
And if the site too is also, people who come to it for the first time, just interested in the project, if we've got a something important like the articulation of method, you want that to be something they can get to with one click as opposed to two or three.
Yeah. Yeah. So for all those reasons and more, I was still kind of, and also partly, we wanted to give Manifold a shakeout. And I mean, like right now, the commenting stuff I think is fairly robust. That you can highlight, you can annotate, you can include features. Include resources.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually kind of interesting how that's set up. Yeah, so I have no problem keeping this here, but it would, as you say, I mean, allow people, because even people who don't have accounts can see this stuff. But if you want to annotate, I believe you do need an account for that.
Yeah.
Can anybody get an account?
I think so. They wouldn't be an admin account, I think.
Yeah, I suppose that's something we should check as well. But
it's
open. All right, have we got anything else to cover then?
That's it.
All right. Okay, so we'll meet again in 2 weeks, and we'll see if we've got a guest by that time or not. And to viewers, of course, if you'd like to contribute, best way probably is to email us, or you can contact Nathaniel through his Twitter feed.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I guess that's it.
Okay.
All right, I will see you.
Goodbye.